wonder how long it would have gone without noticing that I was not, without noticing I was muted. That would make for quite an awkward reading stream, don't you think? Yes, good evening, everyone. Hopefully all y'all are well. Sorry for the slightly extended pre-stream. I had two URLs that I had found during my very, very long 12-hour workday. But I couldn't find which part of Discord I had put them in. I have found them now. One for the stories, as I don't own a physical copy, and I shall be putting it on my Christmas list. And one for the atmospheric background stuff in, the background. I had mentioned it on Twitter, and perhaps you may gather from the title, or maybe not, technically speaking it is alliterative, but rather than doing the stories of Edgar Allan Poe tonight, I will instead be doing them tomorrow night, where I will be joined by my lovely Lily, as she wishes to read through The Raven herself, which is of course something I want to do, but I obviously cannot tell her no, and I would love to see her read it. So maybe I'll read it next year. Who knows? What's important is that I'll have some time with my moo, and that you'll hear my moo. Yay. As for tonight, though, we will be tackling some of the stories of Robert W. Chambers. Now, while I will be reading through a particular collection of those stories, rather than bouncing out round at random, I'm just going to be going through in order, and we'll see how many we get through. I don't really have any other announcements yet, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and kill the music. Turn down the rails a little bit. Put up the creep. And alright. And let us begin reading through The King in Yellow. Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake, the shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that a hag shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead, die thou unsung as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. Cassilda's Song in The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. The Repairer of Reputations, Chapter 1. Do not mock the fools. Their malice lasts longer than ours. That's the only difference. Toward the end of 1920, the government of the United States had practically completed the program adopted during the last months of President Winthrop's administration. The country was apparently tranquil. Everyone knows how the tariff and labor questions were settled. The war with Germany, incident on that country's seizure of the Samoan Islands, had left no visible scars upon the public, and the temporary occupation of Norfolk by the invading army had been forgotten in the joy over repeated naval victories. and the subsequent ridiculous plight of General von Gartenlaub's forces in the state of New Jersey. The Cuban and Hawaiian investments had paid 100%, and the territory of Samoa was well worth its cost as a coaling station. The country was in a superb state of defense. Every coast city had been well supplied with land fortifications. The army under the parental eye of the general staff, organized according to the Prussian system, had been increased to 300,000 men, with a territorial reserve of 1,000,000. 6 magnificent squadrons of cruisers and battleships patrolled the 6 stations of the navigable seas, leaving a steam reserve amply fitted to control home waters. The gentleman from the West had at last been constrained to acknowledge that a college for the training of diplomats was as necessary as law schools are for the training of barristers. Consequently, we were no longer represented abroad by incompetent patriots. The nation was prosperous. Chicago, for a moment paralyzed after the Second Great Fire, had risen from its ruins, white and imperial and more beautiful than the White City which had been built for its plaything in 1893. Everywhere good architecture was replacing bad, laid-out, elevated structures demolished, and underground roads built to replace them. The new government buildings and barracks were fine bits of architecture, and a long system of stone quays, which completely surrounded the island, have been turned into parks, which provide a godsend to the population. The subsidizing of the State Theater and State Opera brought its own reward. The United States National Academy of Design was much like European institutions of the same kind. Nobody envied the Secretary of Fine Arts, either his cabinet position nor his portfolio. The Secretary of Forestry and Game Preservation had a much easier time, thanks to the new system of national mounted police. We had profited well by the latest treaties with France and England, the exclusion of foreign-born Jews as a measure of self-preservation, the settlement of the new independent and Negro state of Swanee, the checking of immigration, and new laws concerning naturalization, and the gradual centralization of power and the executive all contributed to national calm and prosperity. When the government solved the Indian problem and squadrons of Indian cavalry scouts in native costume were substituted for the pitiable organizations tacked on the tail of skeletonized regiments by a former Secretary of War, the nation drew a long sigh of relief. When, after the colossal Congress of Religions, bigotry and ignorance were laid in their graves, and kindness and charity began to draw warring sects together, many thought the millennium had arrived, at least, and the new war, which, after all, is a world by itself. But self-preservation is the first law, and the United States had to look on in helpless sorrow as Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium arrived in the throes of anarchy, while Russia, watching from the Caucasus, stooped and bound them one by one. In the city of New York, the summer of 1899 was signalized by the dismantling of the elevated railroads. The summer of 1900 will live in the memories of New York people for many a cycle. The Dodge statue was removed in that year. In the following winter began that agitation for the repeal of laws prohibiting suicide, which bore its final fruit in the month of April 1920, when the first governmental legal chamber was opened on Washington Square. I had walked down that day from Dr. Archer's house on Madison Avenue, where I had been as a mere formality. Ever since that fall from my horse, 4 years before, I had been troubled at times with pains in the back of my head and neck, but now for months they had been absent, and the doctor sent me away that day, saying there was nothing more to be cured in me. Hardly worth his fee to be told that, I knew it myself. Still, I did not grudge him the money. What I minded was the mistake which he made at first. When they picked me up from the pavement where I lay unconscious, and somebody had mercifully sent a bullet through my horse's head, I was carried to Dr. Archer, and he pronounced my brain affected, placed me in his private asylum where I was obliged to endure treatment for insanity. At last he decided that I was well, and I, knowing that my mind has always been as sound as his, if not sounder, paid my tuition, as he jokingly called it, and left. I told him, smiling, that I would get even with him for his mistake, and he laughed heartily, and asked me to call once in a while. I did so, hoping for a chance to even up accounts, but he gave me none, and I told him I would wait. The fall from my horse had fortunately left no evil results. On the contrary, it had changed my whole character for the better. From a lazy young man about town, I had become active, energetic, temperate, and above all, oh, above all else, ambitious. There was only one thing which troubled me. I laughed at my own uneasiness, and yet it troubled me. During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I'd remembered after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it. But as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, with a cry of fear. Or perhaps it was of joy so poignant they suffered in every nerve. I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it and wept and laughed and trembled with horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me, for I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink into the lake of Halley. My mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth. A world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. When the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease from city to city, from continent to continent. Barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censored even by the most advanced literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages. No doctrine promulgated. No convictions outraged. It could not be judged by any known standard, yet although it was acknowledged that a supreme note of art had been struck in The King in Yellow, all felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect. It was, I remember, the 13th day of April, 1920, that the first government lethal chamber was established on the south side of Washington Square, between Worcester Street and South Fifth Avenue. The block, which had formerly consisted of a lot of shabby old buildings, used as cafes and restaurants for foreigners, had been acquired by the government in the winter of 1898. The French and Italian cafes and restaurants were torn down. The whole block was enclosed by a gilded iron railing, and converted into a lovely garden with lawns, flowers, and fountains. In the center of the garden stood a small, white building, severely classical in architecture, and surrounded by thickets of flowers. 6 Ionic columns supported the roof, and the single door was of bronze. A splendid marble group of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yvain, who had died in Paris when only 23 years old. The inauguration ceremonies were in progress as I crossed University Place and entered the square. I threaded my way through the silent throng of spectators, but was stopped at 4th Street by a cordon of police. A regiment of United States Lancers were drawn up in a hollow square round the lethal chamber. On a raised tribune, facing the Washington Park, stood the governor of New York. Behind him were grouped the mayor of New York and Brooklyn, the investigator general of police, the commandant of the state troops, Colonel Livingston, military aide to the President of the United States, General Blount, commanding at Governor's Island, Major General Hamilton, commanding the garrison of New York and Brooklyn, Admiral Buffby of the fleet of the North River, Surgeon General Lansford, the staff of the National Free Hospital, Senators Weiss and Franklin of New York, and the Commissioner of Public Works. The Tribune was surrounded by a squadron of hussars of the National Guard. The governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end their existence, which may have become intolerable to him through physical suffering or mental despair. It is believed that community will benefit by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creatures, from whose desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily, will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and turned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. "There, a painless death awaits him who can no longer bear the sorrows of this life. If death is welcome, let him seek it there." Then, quickly turning to the military aide of the president's household, he said, "I declare the lethal chamber open." And again, facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, "Citizens of New York and the United States of America, through me the government declares the lethal chamber to be open." The solemn hush was broken by a sharp cry of command. The squadron of hussars filed after the governor's carriage. The lancers wheeled and formed along Fifth Avenue to wait for the commandant of the garrison, and the mounted police followed him. I left the crowd to gape and stare at the white marble death chamber, and, crossing South Fifth Avenue, walked along the western side of that thoroughfare to Bleecker Street. Then I turned to the right and stopped before a dingy shop which bore the sign, "Hauberk Armor." Just putting up a quick warning. I glanced in the doorway and saw Hauberk busy in his little shop at the end of the hall. He looked up and, catching sight of me, cried in his deep, hearty voice. Excuse me, got something caught in my throat. "Come in, Mr. Castaigne." Constance, his daughter, rose to meet me as I crossed the threshold and held out her pretty hand. But I saw the blush of disappointment on her cheeks, and knew that it was another Castaigne she had expected. My cousin Louis. I smiled at her confusion and complimented her on the banner she was embroidering from a colored plate. Old Hauberk saw riveting the worn greaves of some ancient suit of armor, and the ting, ting, ting of his little hammer sounded pleasantly in the quaint shop. Presently he dropped his hammer and fussed about for a moment with a tiny wrench. The soft clash of the mail sent a thrill of pleasure through me. I loved to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, and the jingle of chain armor. That was the only reason I went to see Hauberk. He had never interested in me personally, nor in Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Louis. This did occupy my attention. Sometimes it even kept me awake at night. But I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange their future as I expected to arrange that of my kind doctor, John Archer. However, I should never have troubled myself about visiting them just then, had it not been, as I say, that the music of the tinkling hammer had for me this strong fixation. I would sit for hours, listening and listening, and when the stray sunbeam struck the inlaid steel, the sensation it gave me was almost too keen to endure. My eyes would become fixated, dilating with pleasure that stretched every nerve almost to breaking, until some movement of the old armor cut off the ray of sunlight. Then, still thrilling secretly, I leaned back and listened again to the sound of the polishing rag. Swish, 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 rubbing rust from the rivets. Constance, working with the embroidery over her knees, now and then pausing to examine more closely the pattern and the colored plate from the Metropolitan Museum. "Who is this for?" I asked. Hawberk explained that in addition to the treasures of armor in the Metropolitan Museum, of which he had been appointed armorer, he had also charge of several collections belonging to rich amateurs. This was the missing greave of a famous suit which a client of his had traced to a little shop in Paris, in the Quai d'Orsay. He, Hawberk, had negotiated for and secured the greave, and now the suit was complete. He laid down his hammer and read me the history of the suit, traced since 1450 from owner to owner until it was acquired by Thomas Stanbridge. When his superb collection was sold, this client of Hawberk's bought the suit, and since then the search for the missing greave had been pushed until it was, almost by accident, located in Paris. Did you continue the search so persistently without any certainty of the greave being still in existence? I demanded. Of course, he replied coolly. Then, for the first time, I took a personal interest in Hawberk. It was worth something to you, I ventured. No, he replied, laughing. My pleasure in finding it was my reward. Have you no ambition to be rich? I asked, smiling. My one ambition is to be the best armorer in the world, he answered gravely. Constance asked me if I had seen the ceremonies at the Lethal Chamber. She herself had noticed cavalry passing up Broadway that morning and had wished to see the inauguration, but her father wanted the matter finished, and she had stayed at his request. Did you see your cousin, Mr. Castagna, there? She asked, with the slightest tremor of her soft eyelashes. No, I replied carelessly. Lewis's regiment is maneuvering out in Westchester County. I rose and picked up my hat and cane. Are you going upstairs to see the lunatic again? Laughed old Hawberk. If Hawberk knew how I loathed the word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me, which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. I think I shall drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two. Poor fellow, said Constance with a shake of the head. It must be hard to live alone year after year, crippled and almost demented. It's very good of you, Mr. Castagna, to visit him as often as you do. I think he's vicious, observed Hawberk, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plates. When he had finished, I replied, No, he's not vicious, nor is he in the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our lives to acquire. Hawberk laughed. I continued, a little impatiently. He knows history as no one else could know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that it were known in New York that such a man existed, the people could not honor him enough. Nonsense, muttered Hawberk, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. Is it nonsense? I managing to suppress what I felt. Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cassards of the enameled suit of armor, commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned, can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves, and rag-pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street? Hawberk's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked it up with a great deal of calm, and asked how I knew that the tassets and left cassard were missing from the Princess Emblazoned. I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said they were in a garret of 998 Pallid Street. Nonsense, he cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leather apron. Is this nonsense too? I asked pleasantly. Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continually speaks of you as the Marquis of Avonshire and of Miss Constance? I did not finish, for Constance had started to her feet with terror right on every feature. Harbour looked at me and slowly smoothed out his leathern apron. That is impossible, he observed. Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armor, for instance, and the princess emblazoned. I interposed, smiling. Yes, he continued slowly. About armor, also, maybe. But is wrong in regard to the Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago, and went to Australia, where he did not survive his wife for long. Mr. Wilde is wrong, murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance, Mr. Wilde is wrong, I said. The two. I climbed 3 dilapidated flights of stairs, which I'd so often climbed before, and knocked at a small door at the end of the corridor. Mr. Wilde opened the door, and I walked in. When he had double-locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat down beside me, peering up into my face with his little light-colored eyes. Half a dozen new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced. I thought I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones, which now stood out at an angle from the thin wire, were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have revelled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which was absolutely fingerless, but it seemed to cause him no inconvenience. He was satisfied with his wax ears. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. Found another kernel stuck. He was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were magnificently developed, and his thighs as thick as any athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvelous intellect and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those unfortunates whom people imprison in asylums for the weak-minded. Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was. I do not deny that he was an eccentric. The mania he had for keeping that cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. Never could understand why he kept that creature, nor what pleasure he found in shutting himself up in his room with this surly, vicious beast. I remember once glancing up from a manuscript I was studying by the light of some tallow dips and seeing Mr. Wilde squatting motionless on his high chair, his eyes fairly blazing with excitement, while the cat, which had risen from her place before the stove, came creeping across the floor right at him. Before I could move, she flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face. Howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing until the cat screamed and fled under the cabinet. Mr. Wilde turned over his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. He was eccentric. Mr. Wilde climbed into his high chair, and after studying my face, picked up a dog-eared ledger and opened it. Henry B. Matthews, he read. Bookkeeper with Wysott and Company, dealers in church ornaments. Called April 3rd. Reputation damaged on the racetrack. Known as a welcher. Reputation to be repaired by August 1st. Retainer, $5. He turned the page and ran his fingerless knuckles down the closely written columns. P. Green Dulcenberry, Minister of the Gospel, Fair Beach, New Jersey. Reputation damaged in the Bowery. To be repaired as soon as possible. Retainer, $100. He coughed and added, Called April 6th. Then you are not in need of money, Mr. Wilde, I inquired. Listen, he coughed again. Mrs. C. Hamilton Chester of Chester Park, New York City. Called April 7th. Reputation damaged at Dieppe, France. To be repaired by October 1st. Retainer, $500. Note. C. Hamilton Chester, Captain USS Avalanche, ordered home from South Sea Squadron, October 1st. Well, I said, the profession of a repair of reputations is lucrative. His colorless eyes sought mine. I only wanted to demonstrate that I was correct. You said it was impossible to succeed as a repair of reputations, that even if I did succeed in certain cases, it would cost me more than I would gain by it. Today I have 500 men in my employ, who are poorly paid, but who pursue the work with an enthusiasm which possibly may be born of fear. These men enter every shade and grade of society. Some even are pillars of the most exclusive social temples. Others are the prop and pride of the financial world. Still others hold undisputed sway among the fancy and the talent. I choose them at my leisure, from those who reply to my advertisements. It's easy enough. They're all cowards. I could treble the number in 20 days if I wished. So you see, those who have in their keeping the reputations of their fellow citizens, I have in my pay. They may turn on you, I suggested. He rubbed his thumb over his cropped ears and adjusted the wax substitutes. I think not, he murmured thoughtfully. I seldom have to apply the whip, and then only once. Besides, they like the wages. How do you apply the whip? I demanded. He rubbed his thumb over his... My apologies. His face for a moment was awful to look upon. His eyes dwindled to a pair of green sparks. I invite them to come and have a little chat with me, he said in a soft voice. A knock at the door interrupted him, and his face resumed its amiable expression. "Who is it?" he inquired. "Mr. Stilett," was the answer. "Come tomorrow," replied Mr. Wilde. "It's impossible," began the other, but was silenced by a sort of bark from Mr. Wilde. "Come tomorrow," he repeated. We heard somebody move away from the door and turn the corner by the stairway. "Who is that?" I asked. "Arnold Stilett, owner and editor-in-chief of the Great New York Daily." He drummed on the ledger with his fingerless hand, adding, "I pay him very badly, but he thinks it a good bargain." "Arnold Stilett," I repeated, amazed. "Yes," said Mr. Wilde with a self-satisfied cough. The cat, which had entered the room as he spoke, hesitated, looked up at him, and snarled. He climbed down from the chair and, squatting on the floor, took the creature into his arms and caressed her. The cat ceased snarling and presently began a loud purring, which seemed to increase in timbre as he stroked her. "Where are the notes?" I asked. He pointed to the table, and for the 100th time I picked up the bundle of manuscript entitled The Imperial Dynasty of America. One by one I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning. When from Carcosa the Hyads, Hastur, and Aldebaran, to Castania, Louis de Calvados, born December 19th, 1877. I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat parts of it aloud, dwelling especially on Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castania and Edith Landes Castania, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr. Wilde nodded and coughed. "Speaking of your legitimate ambition," he said, "how do Constance and Louis get along?" "She loves him," I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eye. He flung her off and climbed on the chair opposite me. "And Dr. Archer? Well, that's a matter you can settle any time you wish," he added. "Yes," I replied, "Dr. Archer can wait. But it's time I saw my cousin Louis." "It is time," he repeated. Then he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly. "We are now in communication with 10,000 men," he muttered. "We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours, and in 48 hours the state will rise en masse. The country follows the state, and the portion that will not, California and the Northwest, might better never have been inhabited. I shall not send them the yellow sign." The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered, "A new broom sweeps clean." The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it had seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts, said Mr. Wilde. "You're speaking of the King in Yellow," I groaned with a shudder. "He is a king whom emperors have served." "I am content to serve him," I replied. Mr. Wilde sat rubbing his ears with his crippled hand. "Perhaps Constance does not love him," he suggested. I started to reply, but a sudden burst of military music from the street below drowned my voice. The 20th Dragoon Regiment, formerly in garrison at Mount St. Vincent, was returned from maneuvers in Westchester County to its new barracks on East Washington Square. It was my cousin's regiment. They were a fine lot of fellows in their pale blue, tight-fitting jackets, jaunty busbies, and white riding breeches with a double yellow stripe, into which all their limbs seemed molded. Every other squadron was armed with lances, from the metal points of which fluttered yellow and white pennons. The band passed, playing the regimental march, then came the colonel and staff. The horses crowding and trampling, while their heads bobbed in unison, and pennons fluttered from their lance points. The troopers who rode with the beautiful English seat looked brown as berries from their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester, and the music of their sabres against the stirrups, the jingle of spurs and carbines was delightful to me. I saw Louis riding with his squadron. He was as handsome an officer as I have ever seen. Mr. Wilde, who had mounted a chair by the window, saw him too, but said nothing. Lewis turned and looked straight at Hallberg's shop as he passed. I could see the flush on his brown cheeks. I think Constance must have been at the window. When the last troops had clattered by and the last Spinons vanished into South Fifth Avenue, Mr. Wilde clambered out of his chair and dragged the chest away from the door. "Yes," he said. "It's time that you saw your cousin Lewis." He unlocked the door, and I picked up my hat and stick and stepped into the corridor. The stairs were dark. Groping about, I set my foot on something soft, which snarled and spit. I aimed a murderous blow at the cat, but my cane shivered to splinters against the balustrade, and the beast scurried back into Mr. Wilde's room. Passing Hallberg's door again, I saw him still at work on the armor, but I did not stop, and stepping out into Bleecker Street, I followed it to Worcester, skirted the grounds of the lethal chamber, and crossing Washington Park went straight to my rooms in a Benedict. Here I lunched comfortably, read The Herald and the Meteor, and finally went to the steel safe in my bedroom and set the time combination. The 3 3/4 minutes which is necessary to wait while the time lock is opening are to me golden moments. From the instant I set the combination to the moment I grasp the knobs and swing back the solid steel doors, I live in an ecstasy of expectation. These moments must be like moments passed in Paris. I know what I am to find at the end of the time limit. I know what the massive safe holds secure for me alone, and the exquisite pleasure of waiting is hardly enhanced when the safe opens, and I lift from its velvet crown a diadem of purest gold, blazing with diamonds. I do this every day, and yet the scorn of waiting, and last touching again the diadem, only seems to increase as the days pass. It is a diadem fit for a king among kings, an emperor among emperors. The king in yellow might scorn it, but it shall be worn by his royal servant. I held it in my arms until the alarm in the safe rang harshly, and then, tenderly, proudly, I replaced it and shut the steel doors. I walked slowly back to my study, which faces Washington Square, and leaned on the windowsill. The afternoon sun poured into my windows, and a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the elms and maples in the park, now covered with buds and tender foliage. A flock of pigeons circled about the tower of the Memorial Church, sometimes alighting on the purple-tiled roof, sometimes wheeling downward to the lotus fountain in front of the marble arch. The gardeners were busy with the flower beds around the fountain, and the freshly turned earth smelled sweet and spicy. A lawn-mower, drawn by a fat white horse, clinked across the green sward, and watering carts poured showers of spray over the asphalt drives. Around the statue of Peter Stuyvesant, which in 1897, and who I am no doubt mispronouncing, had replaced the monstrosity supposed to represent Garibaldi, children played in the spring sunshine, and nurse girls wheeled elaborate baby carriages with a reckless disregard for the pasty-faced occupants, which could probably be explained by the presence of half a dozen trim dragoon troopers languidly lolling on the benches. Through the trees, the Washington Memorial Arch glistened like silver in the sunshine, and beyond, on the eastern extremity of the square, the grey stone barracks of the dragoons and the white granite artillery stables were alive with colour and motion. I looked at the lethal chamber on the corner of the square opposite. A few curious people still lingered about the gilded iron railing, but inside the grounds the paths were deserted. I watched the fountains ripple and sparkle. The sparrows had already found this new bathing nook. The basins were covered with the dusty, feathered little things. 2 or 3 white peacocks picked their way across the lawns, and a drab-colored pigeon sat so motionlessly on the arm of one of the fates that it seemed to be a part of the sculptured stone. As I was turning carelessly away, a slight commotion and a group of curious loiterers around the gates attracted my attention. A young man had entered, and was advancing with nervous strides along the gravelled path, which leads to the bronze doors of the lethal chamber. He paused a moment before the fates. As he raised his head to those three mysterious faces, the pigeon rose from its sculpted perch, circled about for a moment, and wheeled to the east. The young man pressed his hand to his face, and then, with an undefinable gesture, sprang up the marble steps. The bronze doors closed behind him. Half an hour later, the loiterers slouched away. The frightened pigeon returned to its perch in the arms of fate. I put on my hat and went out into the park for a little while before dinner. As I crossed the central driveway, a group of officers passed, and one of them called out, "Hello, Hildred," and came back to shake hands with me. It was my cousin Lewis, who stood smiling, tapping his spurred heels with his riding whip. "Just back from Westchester," he said. "Been doing the booklick. Milk and curds, dairy maids in sunbonnets, who say howl. Don't think when you tell them they're pretty. I'm nearly dead for a square meal at Delmonico's. What's the news?" "There is none," I replied pleasantly. "I saw your regiment coming in this morning." "Did you?" "I didn't see you. Where were you?" "In Mr. Wilde's window." "Hell," he began impatiently. "That man is stark mad. I don't understand why you—" He saw how annoyed I felt by this outburst, and begged my pardon. "Really, old chap," he said, "I don't mean to run down a man you like, but for the life of me, I can't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wilde. He's not well bred, to put it generously. He's hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum, so have I interrupted calmly. Lewis looked startled and confused for a moment, but recovered and slapped me heartily on the shoulder. "You were completely cured," he began, but I stopped him again. "I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged never to have been insane." "Of course, that's what I meant," he laughed. I disliked his laugh because I knew it was forced, but I nodded gaily and asked him where he was going. Lewis looked after his brother officers, who had now almost reached Broadway. We had attempted to sample a Brunswick cocktail, but to tell you the truth, I was anxious for an excuse to go and see Harbrook instead. "Come along, I'll make you my excuse." We found old Harbrook, neatly attired in a fresh spring suit, standing at the air shop and sniffing the air. "I just decided to take Constance for a little stroll before dinner," he replied to the impetuous volley of questions from Lewis. "We thought of walking on the park terrace along the North River." At that moment, Constance appeared and grew pale and rosy by turns, as Lewis bent over her small gloved fingers. I tried to excuse myself, alleging an engagement uptown, but Lewis and Constance would not listen, and I saw I was expected to remain and engage old Harbrook's attention. After all, it would be just as well if I kept my eye on Lewis, I thought, and when they hailed a Spring Street horse car, I got in after them and took my seat beside the armorer. The beautiful line of parks and granite terraces overlooking the wharves along the North River, which were built in 1910 and finished in the autumn of 1917, had become one of the most popular promenades in the metropolis. They extended from the Battery to 190th Street, overlooking the noble river and affording a fine view of the Jersey shore and Highland opposite. Cafes and restaurants were scattered here and there among the trees, and twice a week military bands from the garrison played in the kiosks on the parapets. We sat down in the sunshine on the bench at the foot of the equestrian statue of General Sheridan. Constance tipped her sunshade to shield her eyes, and she and Lewis began a murmuring conversation which was impossible to catch. Old Harbrook, leaning on his ivory-headed cane, lighted an excellent cigar, the mate, to which I politely refused and smiled at vacancy. The sun hung low above the Staten Island woods, and the bay was dyed with golden hues, reflected from the sun-warmed sails of the shipping in the harbor. Brigs, schooners, yachts, clumsy ferryboats, their decks swarming with people. Railroad transports carrying lines of brown, blue, and white freight cars, stately sound steamers, declass tramp steamers, coasters, dredgers, sculls, and everywhere pervading the entire bay, impudent little tugs puffing and whistling officiously. These were the craft which churned the sunlight waters as far as the eye could reach. In calm contrast to the hurry of sailing vessel and steamer, a silent fleet of white warships lay motionless in midstream. "What are you staring at?" she inquired. "Nothing. The fleet." Then Lewis told us what the vessels were, pointing out each by its relative position to the old red fort on Governor's Island. "That little cigar-shaped thing is a torpedo boat," he explained. "They're far more lying close together. They're the Tarpon, the Falcon, the Sea Fox, and the Octopus. The gunboats just above are the Princeton, the Chamberlain, the Stillwater, and the Erie. Next to them lie the cruisers Farragut and Los Angeles, and above them the battleships California and Dakota, and Washington, which is the flagship. Those two squatty-looking chunks of metal, which anchor there off Castle William, are the double-turreted monitors, terrible and magnificent. Behind them lies the ram, Acelia." Constance looked at him with deep approval in her beautiful eyes. "What loads of things you know for a soldier," she said. We all joined in the laugh which followed. Presently, Lewis rose with a nod to us and offered his arm to Constance. They strolled away along the river wall. Hawberk watched them for a moment, and then turned to me. "Mr. Wilde was right. I found the missing tassets and left cassard of the Princess Emblazoned in a vile old junk garret in Pell Street." 998? I inquired with a smile. "Yes." "Mr. Wilde is a very intelligent man," I observed. "I want to give him the credit of this most important discovery," this continued Hawberk, "and I intend it. It shall be known that he is entitled to the fame of it." "He won't thank you for that," I answered sharply. "Please say nothing about it." "Do you know what it's worth?" said Hawberk. "No, $50, perhaps." "It is valued at $500, but the owner of the Princess Emblazoned will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wilde." "He doesn't want it. He refuses it," I answered angrily. "What do you know about Mr. Wilde? He doesn't need the money. He is rich, or will be richer than any living man except myself. What will we care for money then? What will we care, he and I, when what?" demanded Hawberk, astonished. "You will see," I replied, on my guard again. He looked at me narrowly, much as Dr. Archer used to, and I knew he thought I was mentally unsound. Perhaps it was fortunate for him that he did not use the word lunatic just then. "No," I replied to his unspoken thought. "I am not mentally weak. My mind is as healthy as Mr. Wilde's. I do not care to explain just yet what I have on hand, but it is an investment, which will pay more than mere gold, silver, and precious stones. It will secure the happiness and prosperity of a continent. Yes, a hemisphere." "Oh," said Hawberk. "And eventually," I continued more quietly, "it will secure the happiness of the whole world. And, incidentally, your own happiness and prosperity, as well as Mr. Wilde's." "Exactly," I smiled. "But I could have throttled him for taking that tone." He looked at me in silence for a while, and then said very gently, "Why don't you give up your books and studies, Mr. Castaigne? Take a tramp among the mountains somewhere or other. You used to be fond of fishing. Take a cast or two at the trout and oranglets. I don't care for fishing anymore, I answered, without a shade of annoyance in my voice. You used to be fond of everything, he continued. Athletics, yachting, shooting, riding. I have never cared to ride since my fall, I said quietly. Ah, yes, your fall, he repeated, looking away from me. I thought this nonsense had gone far enough, so I brought the conversation back to Mr. Wilde. He was scanning my face again in a manner highly offensive to me. Mr. Wilde, he repeated. Do you know what he did this afternoon? He came downstairs and nailed a sign over the hall door next to mine. It read, Mr. Wilde, Repair of Reputations, third bell. Do you know what a repair of reputations can be? I do, I replied, suppressing the rage within. Oh, he said again. Louis and Constance came strolling by and stopped to ask if we would join them. Hallberg looked at his watch. At the moment, a puff of smoke shot from the casemates of Castle William, and a boom of the sunset gun rolled across the water. It was re-echoed from the highland opposite. The flag came running down from the flagpole. The bugle sounded on the white decks of the warships, and the first electric light sparkled out from the Jersey shore. As I turned to the city with Hallberg, I heard Constance mutter something to Louis which I did not understand. But Louis whispered, "My darling," in reply, and again, walking ahead with Hallberg through the square, I heard a murmur of "Sweetheart," and "my own Constance," and I knew the time had nearly arrived when I should speak of important matters with my cousin Louis. Chapter 3. One morning early in May, I stood before the steel safe in my bedroom, trying on the golden jeweled crown. The diamonds flashed fire as I turned the mirror, and the heavy beaten gold burned like a halo about my head. I remembered Camilla's agonized scream, and the awful words echoing through the dim streets of Carcosa. They were the last lines in the first act, and I dared not think of what followed. Dared not, even in the spring sunshine, there in my own room surrounded with familiar objects, reassured by the bustle from the street and the voices of the servants in the hallway outside. But those poisoned words had dropped slowly into my heart, as stiff sweat drops upon a bedsheet and is absorbed. Trembling, I put the diadem from my head and wiped my forehead. But I thought of Hester and of my own rightful ambition, and I remembered Mr. Wilde as I had left him, his face all torn and bloody from the claws of that devil's creature. And what he said. The alarm bell in the safe began to whir harshly, and I knew my time was up. But I would not heed it, and replacing the flashing circlet upon my head, I turned defiantly to the mirror. I stood for a long time absorbed in the changing expression of my own eyes, the mirror reflecting a face which was like my own, but whiter, and so thin that I hardly recognized it. And all the time I kept repeating between my clenched teeth, "The day has come! The day has come!" While the alarm in the safe whirred and clamored, the diamond sparkled and flamed above my brow. I heard a door open, but did not heed it. It was only when I saw two faces in the mirror. It was only when another face rose above my shoulder and two other eyes met mine. I wheeled like a flash and seized the long knife from my dressing table, and my cousin sprang back very pale, crying, "Hildred, for God's sake!" Then, as my hand fell, he said, "It is I, Louis. Don't you know me?" I stood silent. I could not have spoken for my life. He walked up to me and took the knife from his hand. "What is all this?" he inquired in a gentle voice. "Are you ill?" "No," I replied, but I doubt you heard me. "Come, come, old fellow," he cried. "Take off that brass crown and toddle into the study. Are you going to a masquerade? What's all this theatrical tinsel, anyway?" I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any better for thinking so. I let him take it from my hand, knowing it was best to humor him. He tossed the splendid diadem in the air, and, catching it, turned to me smiling. "It's dear at 50 cents, he sighed. "What's it for?" I did not answer, but took the circlet from his hands, and, placing it in the safe, shut the massive steel door. The alarm ceased its infernal din at once. He watched me curiously, but did not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. Fearing lest he might examine the combination, I led the way into my study. Louis threw himself on the sofa and flicked at flies with his eternal riding whip. He wore his fatigue uniform with the braided jacket and jaunty cap, and I noticed that his riding boots were all splashed with red mud. "Where have you been?" I inquired. "Jumping mud creeks in Jersey," he said. "I haven't had time to change yet. I was rather in a hurry to see you. Haven't you got a glass of something? I'm dead tired. Been in the saddle 24 hours. I gave him some brandy from my medicinal store, which he drank with a grimace. "Damned bad stuff," he observed. "I'll give you an address where they sell brandy that is brandy." "It's good enough for my needs," I observed. "I use it to rub my chest with." He stared and flicked down another fly. "See here, old fellow," he began. "I've got something to suggest to you. It's 4 years now that you've shut yourself up in here like an owl, never going anywhere, never taking any healthy exercise, never doing a damn thing but poring over those books up there on the mantelpiece." He glanced along the row of shelves. Napoleon, 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 he read. For heaven's sake, have you nothing but Napoleon, sir? I wish they were bound in gold, I said. But wait, yes, there is another book. The King in Yellow. I looked him steadily in the eye. Have you never read it? I asked. I? Oh, thank God, I don't want to be driven crazy. I saw he regretted his speech as soon as he had uttered it. There is only one word which I loathe more than I do lunatic. That word is crazy. But I controlled myself and asked him why he thought the King in Yellow was dangerous. No, I don't know, he said hastily. I only remember the excitement it created and denunciations from pulpit and press. I believe the author shot himself after bringing forth the monstrosity, didn't he? I understand he's still alive, I answered. That's probably true, he muttered. Bullets could kill a fiend like that. It's a book of great truths, I said. Yes, he replied, of truths which send men frantic and last their lives. I don't care if the thing is, as they say, the very supreme essence of art. It's a crime to have written it, and I, for one, shall never open its pages. Is that what you've come to tell me? I asked. No, he said. I came to tell you that I'm going to be married. I believe for a moment my heart ceased to beat, but I kept my eyes on his face. Yes, he continued, smiling happily. Married to the sweetest girl on earth. Constance Hawberk, I said mechanically. How do you know? He cried, astonished. I didn't know it myself until that evening last April, when we strolled down to the embankment before dinner. When is it to be? I asked. It was to have been next September. About an hour ago a dispatch came ordering our regiment to the Presidio, San Francisco. We leave at noon tomorrow. Tomorrow, he repeated. Thank Hildred. Tomorrow I shall be the happiest fellow that ever drew breath in this jolly world, for Constance will go with me. I offered him my hand in congratulations, and he seized it, and shook it like the good-natured fellow he was. Or pretended to be. I'm going to get my squadron as a wedding present, he rattled on. Captain and Mrs. Louis Castagna, Hildred? And then he told me where it was to be, and who were to be there, and made me promise to come and be best man. I set my teeth and listened to his boyish chatter without showing what I felt. But I was getting to the limit of my endurance, and when he jumped up and switched his spurs, they jingled, and said he must go. I did not detain him. There's one thing I want to ask of you, I said quietly. Out with it. It's promised, he laughed. I want you to meet me for a quarter of an hour's talk tonight. Of course, if you wish, he said, somewhat puzzled. Where? Anywhere in the park there. What time, Hildred? Midnight. What in the name of... he began, but checked himself and laughingly assented. I watched him go down the stairs and hurry away, his saber banging at every stride. He turned into Bleecker Street, and I knew he was going to see Constance. I gave him 10 minutes to disappear, and then followed in his footsteps, taking with me the jeweled crown and the silken robe embroidered with the yellow sign. When I turned into Bleecker Street and entered the doorway which bore the sign, Mr. Wilde, Repair of Reputations, Third Bell. I saw old Hawberk moving about in his shop, and imagined I heard Constance's voice in the parlor, but I avoided them both and hurried up the trembling stairways to Mr. Wilde's apartment. I knocked and entered without ceremony. Mr. Wilde lay groaning on the floor, his face covered with blood, his clothes torn to shreds. Drops of blood were scattered about over the carpet, which had also been ripped and frayed in the evidently recent struggle. "It's that cursed cat," he said, ceasing his groans, and turning his colourless eyes to me. "She attacked me while I was asleep. I believe she'll kill me yet." This was too much, so I went into the kitchen, and, seizing a hatchet from the pantry, started to find the infernal beast and settle her then and there. My search was fruitless, and after a while I gave it up and came back to find Mr. Wilde squatting on his high chair by the table. He had washed his face and changed his clothes. The great furrows which the cat's claws had ploughed up his face he had filled with collodion, and a rag hid the wound in his throat. I told him I should kill the cat when I came across her, but he only shook his head and turned to the open ledger before him. He read name after name of the people who had come to him in regard to their reputation. The sums he had amassed were startling. I put on the screws now and then, he explained. One day or other, some of these people will assassinate you, I insisted. Do you think so? He said, rubbing his mutilated ears. It was useless to argue with him, so I took down a manuscript entitled Imperial Dynasty of America. For the last time I should ever take it down in Mr. Wilde's study. I read it through, thrilling and trembling with pleasure. When I had finished, Mr. Wilde took the manuscript and, turning to the dark passage which leads from his study to his bedchamber, called out in a loud voice. What is? The fuck is that? That was weird. Was there about that? Well, let me refine my place. When I had finished, Mr. Wilde took the manuscript and, turning to the dark passage which leads from his study to his bedchamber, called out in a loud voice, That's! Then, for the first time, I had noticed a man crouching there in the shadow. How I had overlooked him during my search for the cat, I cannot imagine. That's, come in, cried Mr. Wilde. The figure rose and crept toward us, and I shall never forget the face that he raised to mine as the light from the window illuminated it. This is Mr. Castagna, said Mr. Wilde. But before he had finished speaking, the man threw himself on the ground before the table, crying and grasping. Oh, my God, help me! Forgive me! Oh, Mr. Castagna, keep that man away! You cannot mean it! You're different! Save me! I'm broken down. I was in a madhouse, and now, when all was coming right, when I'd forgotten the king in yellow, but I shall go mad again. I shall go mad! His voice died in a choking rattle, for Mr. Wilde had leapt on him, and his right hand encircled the man's throat. When Vance fell in a heap on the floor, Mr. Wilde clambered nimbly into his chair again, and, rubbing his mangled ears with the stump of his hand, turned to me and asked me for the ledger. I reached it down from the shelf and opened it. After a moment's searching among the beautifully written pages, he coughed complacently and pointed to the name Vance. Vance, he read aloud. Osgood Oswald Vance. At the sound of his name, the man on the floor raised his head and turned a convulsed face to Mr. Wilde. His eyes were injected with blood, his lips tumefied. Called April 28th, continued Mr. Wilde. Occupation. Cashier in the Seaforth National Bank. Has served the term of forgery at Sing Sing, from whence he was transferred to the Asylum for the Criminally Insane. Pardoned by the Governor of New York and discharged from the asylum January 19th, 1918. Reputation damaged at the Sheep's Head Bay. Rumors that he lives beyond his income. Reputation to be repaired once. Retainer, $1,500. Note: has embezzled sums amounting to $30,000 since March 20th, 1919. Excellent family, and secured a present position through uncle's influence. Father, president of Seaforth Bank. I looked at the man on the floor. Get up, Vance, said Mr. Wilde in a gentle voice. Vance rose as if hypnotized. He will do as we suggest now, observed Mr. Wilde, and, opening the manuscript, he read the entire history of the Imperial Dynasty of America. Then, in a kind and soothing murmur, he ran over the important points with Vance, who stood like one stunned. His eyes were so blank and vacant that I imagined he had become half-witted, and remarked it to Mr. Wilde, who replied that it was of no consequence anyway. Very patiently we pointed out to Vance what his share in the affair would be, and he seemed to understand after a while. Mr. Wilde explained the manuscript, using several volumes on heraldry to substantiate the result of his researches. He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hastur, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Casilda and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of Deme and the Lake of Hali. The scalloped tatters of the King in Yellow must hide still forever, he muttered. I do not believe Vance heard him. Then by degrees, which led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family, to Wat and Thale, from Notolba and Phantom of Truth to Aldons, and then tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. Fascinated and thrilled, I watched him. He threw up his head, his long arms stretched out in a magnificent gesture of pride and power, and his eyes blazed deep in their sockets like two emeralds. Vance listened, stupefied. As for me, when at last Mr. Wilde had finished, and pointing to me, cried, "The cousin of the king!" My head swam with excitement. Controlling myself with superhuman effort, I explained to Vance why I alone was worthy of the crown and why my cousin must be exiled or die. I made him understand that my cousin must never marry, even after renouncing all his claims, and how that least of all he should marry the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire and bring England into the question. I showed him a list of thousands of names which Mr. Wilde had drawn up. Every man whose name was there had received the yellow sign, which no living human being dared disregard. The city, the state, the whole land were ready to rise and tremble before the pallid mask. The time had come. The people should know the son of Hastur, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wilde drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Harbuck's rooms. Then he wrote out the order and affixed the seal. Shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name, Hildred Rex. Mr. Wilde clambered to the floor and, unlocking the cabinet, took a long square box from the first shelf. This he brought to the table and opened. A new life lay in the tissue paper inside it. I picked it up and handed it to Vance, along with the order and a plan of Harbuck's apartment. Then Mr. Wilde told Vance he could go, but he went, shambling like an outcast of the slums. I sat for a while, watching the daylight fade behind the square tower of the Judson Memorial Church, and finally, gathering up the manuscript and notes, took my hat and started for the door. Mr. Wilde watched me in silence. When I stepped into the hall, I looked back. Mr. Wilde's small eyes were still fixed on me. Behind him, the shadows gathered in the fading light. Then I closed the door behind me and went out into the darkening streets. I'd eaten nothing since breakfast, but I was not hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature, who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber, noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money, I don't know why. He went away without thanking me. An hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket, on which was traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He looked at it stupidly for a moment, and then with an uncertain glance at me, folded it with what seemed to be to me exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. The electric lights were sparkling among the trees, and the new moon shone in the sky above the lethal chamber. It was tiresome waiting in the square. I wandered from Marble Arch to the artillery stables and back again to the lotus fountain. The flowers and grass exhaled a fragrance which troubled me. The jet of the fountain played in the moonlight, and the musical splash of falling drops reminded me of the tinkle of chained mail in Harbuck's shop. But it was not so fascinating, and the dull sparkle of the moonlight on the water brought no such sensations of exquisite pleasure as when the sunshine played over the polished steel of a corselet on Harbuck's knee. I watched the bat starting and turning above the water plants into a fountain basin, but the rapid, jerky flight set my nerves on edge. and I went away again to walk aimlessly to and fro among the trees. The artillery stables were dark, but in the cavalry barracks the officers' windows were brightly lighted, and the sally port was constantly filled with troopers in fatigue, carrying straw and harnesses and baskets filled with tin dishes. Twice the mounted sentry at the gates was changed while I wandered up and down the asphalt walk. I looked at my watch. It was nearly time. The lights in the barracks went out one by one, the barred gate was closed, and every minute or two an officer passed in through the side wicket, leaving a rattle of accoutrement and jingle of spurs on the night air. The square had become very silent. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the grey-coated park policeman, and car tracks along the Worcester Street were deserted. The only sound which broke the stillness was the stamping of the sentry's horse, and the ring of his sabre against the saddle pommel. In the barracks, the officers' quarters were still lighted, and military servants passed and repassed before the bay windows. 12 o'clock sounded from the new spire of St. Francis Xavier, and at the last stroke of the bad toned bell, a figure passed through the wicket beside the portcullis, returned the salute of the sentry, and crossing the street, entered the square and advanced toward the Benedict apartment house. "Lewis," I called. The man pivoted on his spurred heels and came straight toward me. "Is that you, Hildred?" "Yes, you're on time." I took his offered hand, and we strolled toward the lethal chamber. He rattled on about his wedding, and the graces of Constance, and their future prospects, calling my attention to his captain's shoulder straps, and the triple gold arabesque on his sleeve and fatigue cap. I believe I listened as much to the music of his spurs and sabre as I did his boyish babble, and at last we stood under the elms on the 4th Street corner of the square opposite the lethal chamber. Then he laughed and asked me why I wanted to tell him. I motioned him to a seat on the bench under the electric light and sat down beside him. He looked at me curiously with that same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. I felt the insult of his look, but he did not know it, and I carefully concealed my feelings. "Well, old chap," he inquired, "what can I do for you?" I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and, looking him in the eye, said, "I will tell you. On your word as a soldier, promise me to read this manuscript from beginning to end, without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen to what I have to tell later." "I promise, if you wish it," he said pleasantly. "Give me the paper, Hildred." He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air, which made me tremble with suppressed anger. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted, and his lips seemed to form the word "rubbish." Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read with an attempt at interest, which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when in the closely written pages he came to his own name. When he came to mine, he lowered the paper. and looked sharply at me for a moment. But he kept his word and resumed his reading. I left a half-formed question die on his lips, unanswered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes, and he settled back, pushing his fatigue cap up to his forehead with a boyish gesture, which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished, I took the notes of the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. The nine-folded scroll marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but he did not seem to recognize it. I called his attention to it somewhat sharply. "Well," he said, "I see it. What is it?" "It is the yellow sign," I said angrily. "Oh, that's it, is it?" said Lewis, in that flattering voice which Dr. Archer used to employ with me, or would probably have employed again had I not settled his affair for him. I kept my rage down and answered as steadily as possible. "Listen, you have engaged your word." "I'm listening, old chap," he replied soothingly. I began to speak very calmly. Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago, I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house, in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final. Lewis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly. There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in the interests of Mr. Wilde and myself. They are my cousin Lewis, Mr. Hawberk, and his daughter Constance. Lewis sprang to his feet, and I rose also, and flung the paper marked with the yellow sign to the ground. "Oh, I don't need that to tell you what I have to say," I cried with a laugh of triumph. "You must renounce the crown to me, do you hear? To me." Lewis looked at me with a startled air, but recovering himself, said kindly, "Of course I renounce what is it I must renounce?" "The crown," I said angrily. "Of course," he answered, "I renounce it. Come, old chap, I'll walk back to your rooms with you." "Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me," I cried, trembling with fury. "Don't act as if you think I'm insane." "What nonsense," he replied. "Come, it's getting late, Hildred." "No," I shouted. "You must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown, and in reward I grant you exile. But if you refuse, you shall die." He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and, drawing my long knife, barred his way. Then I told him how they would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vance and his knife, and the order signed by me. "Ha ha, you are the king," I cried, "but I shall be king. Who are you to keep me from empire over all habitable earth? I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king." Lewis stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path to the bronze doors at full speed, and plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented, and I laughed until I wept tears. For I had recognized Vance, and I knew that Hawberk and his daughter were no longer in my way. "Go!" I cried to Lewis. "You've ceased to be a menace. You'll never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow." Then I turned and darted into South Fifth Avenue. With a cry of terror, Lewis dropped his belt and saber and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Bleecker Street. I dashed into the doorway under Hawberk's sign. He cried, "Halt, or I shall fire!" But when he saw that I flew up the stairs, leaving Hawberk's shops below, he left me, and I heard him hammering and shouting at the door as though it were possible to arouse the dead. Mr. Wilde's door was open, and I entered, crying, "It is done! It is done! Let the nations rise and look upon their king." But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from its case. Then I drew on the white silk robe embroidered with the yellow sign, and placed the crown upon my head. At last I was king. King by my right and Hester. King because I knew of the mystery of the hides, and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake of Hali. I was king. The first grey pencilings of dawn would raise a tempest which would shake two hemispheres. Then, as I stood, my every nerve pitched to the highest tension, faint with the joy and splendor of my thought, without, in the dark passage, a man groaned. I seized the tallow dip and sprang to the door. The cat passed me like a demon, and the tallow dip went out. But my long knife flew swifter than she, and I heard her screech. I knew that my knife had found her. For a moment, I listened to her tumbling and thumping about in the darkness. And then when her frenzy ceased, I lighted the lamp and raised it over my head. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came into his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm stretched his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave place to hope. But as I bent over him, his eyeballs rolled clean around in his head, and he died. Then while I stood, transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, every hope and ambition, my very life lying prostrate there with the dead master, they came, seizing me from behind, and bound me until my veins stood out like cords, and my voice failed with paroxysms of my frenzied screams. But I still raged, bleeding and infuriated among them, and more than one policeman felt my sharp teeth. Then, when I could no longer move, they came near. I saw old Hawberk, and behind them my cousin Lewis's ghastly face. And farther away in the corner a woman, Constance, weeping softly. "Ah, I see it!" I shrieked. "You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe! Woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the King in Yellow." Editor's note: Mr. Castagnier died yesterday in the asylum for criminally insane. Seeing as we're near the 2-hour mark, I'll only read one more story, and then we'll be finished for tonight. This is one that I do plan on potentially getting back to at some point in the future. It's not exactly one singular story, but they are all around the same theme, and some of them share characters, so... Right now, just taking a quick moment to relieve my throat, sip some tea, finish off a bit of dinner. Give me just a moment. I just need to check something and help Lily with something. Hopefully everyone's doing well. Hopefully all are enjoying the reading. I know I don't have many people in the chat at the moment, but hopefully there are some people who are listening to or watching the VODs. Gray does enjoy listening to me read time now and again, so. Alright, sorry for the late. Next we have the mask. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed. Casilda, indeed, it's time. You've all laid aside disguise but you. Stranger, I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified aside to Casilda. No mask. No mask! The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. Although I knew nothing of chemistry, I listened fascinated. He picked up an Easter lily which Guinevere had brought that morning from Notre Dame, and dropped it into the basin. Instantly the liquid lost its crystalline clearness. For a second the lily was enveloped in a milk-white foam, which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same instant he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. "There's no danger," he explained. "If you choose the right moment, the golden ray is the signal." He held the lily toward me, and I turned it in my hand. It had turned to stone, to the purest marble. "You see," he said, "it is without flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it?" The marble was white as snow, but in its depths the veins of the lily were tinged with palest azure, and a faint flush lingered deep in its heart. "Don't ask me the reason of that," he smiled, noticing my wonder. "I have no idea why the veins and heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday I tried one of Guinevere's goldfish. There it is. The fish looked as if sculpted in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautifully veined with a faint blue. From somewhere within came a rosy light like the tint which slumbers in an opal. I looked into the basin. Once more it seemed filled with clearest crystal. "If I should touch it now?" I demanded. "I don't know," he replied, "but you had better not try." "There is one thing I'm curious about," I said, "and that is where the ray of sunlight came from." "It looked like a sunbeam, true enough," he said. "I don't know, it always comes when I immerse any living thing. Perhaps," he continued, smiling, "perhaps it is the vital spark of the creature escaping to the source from whence it came." I saw he was mocking, and threatened him with a maul stick, but he only laughed and changed the subject. "Stay to lunch. Guinevere will be here directly." "I saw her going to early mass," I said. "She looked as fresh and sweet as that lily. Before you destroyed it." "Do you think I destroyed it?" said Boris gravely. "Destroyed, preserved, how can we tell?" We sat in the corner of a studio near his unfinished group of the Fates. He leaned back on the sofa, twirling his sculptor's chisel and squinting at his work. "By the way," he said, "I finished pointing up that old academic Ariadne? I'm not familiar with the term, so I apologize. I will mispronounce it. I suppose it will have to go to the salon. It's all I have ready this year, but after the success the Madonna brought me, I feel ashamed to send a thing like that." The Madonna, an exquisite marble for which Guinevere had sat, had been the sensation of the last year's salon. I looked at the Ariadne. It was a magnificent piece of technical work, but I agreed with Boris that the world would expect something better of him than that. Still, it was impossible now to think of finishing in time for the salon, that splendid, terrible group of half-shrouded marble behind me. The Fates would have to wait. We were proud of Boris Yvonne. We claimed him, and he claimed us, on the strength of his having been born in America, although his father was French and his mother was Russian. Everyone in the Beaux Arts called him Boris, and yet there are only two of us whom he addressed in the same familiar way, Jack Scott and myself. Perhaps my being in love with Guinevere had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all was settled, and she had told him with tears in her eyes that it was Boris whom she loved, I went over to his house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us, I always believed, although to one at least it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Guinevere ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Guinevere was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus in Gounod's Mass. But I was always glad when she changed that mood for what we called her April maneuvers. She was often as variable as an April day. In the morning grave, dignified and sweet, at noon laughing, capricious, at evening whatever one least expected. I preferred her so rather than that Madonna-like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Guinevere when he spoke again. What do you think of my discovery, Alec? I think it wonderful. I shall make no use of it, you know, beyond satisfying my own curiosity so far as may be, and a secret will die with me. It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography. Boris nodded, playing with the edge of the chisel. This new vicious discovery would corrupt the world of art. No, I shall never confide the secret to anyone, he said slowly. I would be hard to find anyone less informed about such phenomena than myself, but of course I had heard of mineral springs so saturated with silica that the leaves and twigs which fell into them were turned to stone after a time. I dimly comprehended the process, how the silica replaced the vegetable matter, atom by atom, and the result was a duplicate of the object in stone. This, I confess, had never interested me greatly, and as for the ancient fossils thus produced, they disgusted me. Boris, it appeared, feeling rather curious instead of repugnance, had investigated the subject and had accidentally stumbled on a solution which, attacking the immersed object with a ferocity unheard of, in a second did a work of years. This was all I could make out of the strange story he had just been telling me. He spoke again after a long silence. I'm almost frightened when I think what I have found. Scientists would go mad over the discovery. It was so simple, too. It discovered itself. When I think of that formula, and that new element precipitated in metallic scales... What new element? I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't believe I ever shall. There are enough precious metals out in the world to cut throats over. I pricked up my ears. We struck gold, Boris. Oh, better. But see here, Alec, he laughed, starting up. You and I have all we need in this world. How sinister and covetous you look already. I laughed too, and told him I was devoured by the desire for gold, and we had better talk of something else. So when Guinevere came in shortly after, we had turned our backs on alchemy. Guinevere was dressed in silvery grey from head to foot, the light glinting along the soft curves of her fair hair as she turned her cheek to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before it had touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, "You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon." This was also something new. She had always asked me herself until today. I did, said Boris shortly. And you said yes, I hope. She turned to me with a charming, conventional smile. I might have been an acquaintance of the day before yesterday. I made her a low bow. Fuck, it's French. Je vais bien l'honneur, madame. Which I can only assume means it would be my honor. But refusing to take up our usual bantering tone, she murmured a hospitable commonplace and disappeared. Boris and I looked at one another. I had better go home, don't you think? I asked. Magdivino, he replied, frankly. While we were discussing the advisability of my departure, Guinevere appeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her color was too deep and her lovely eyes too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. Luncheon is ready. Was I cross, Alec? I thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris. And she slipped her other arm through his. Alec knows that after you, there's no one in the world whom I like as well as I like him. So if he sometimes feels snubbed, it won't hurt him. À la bonne heure, I cried. Who says there are no thunderstorms in April? Are you ready? Chanted Boris. Aye, ready. And arm in arm, we raced into the dining room, scandalizing the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Guinevere was 18, Boris was 23, and I not quite 21. Hey, Timmy. Hope you're doing well. Head pats for the little guy. Pat, 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 pat. You've joined sometime during the second of the tales I will be reading tonight, the Mask. Currently on to chapter 2 of 4. This is a shorter one, and I'll be done once I'm, through this for tonight. Leastwise to rest my poor throat. Leastwise because I worked a 12-hour shift today, and I have a 12-hour shift tomorrow, and a 12-hour shift after that. Pay and peck. Chapter 2. Some work that I was doing about this time on the decorations for Guinevere's boudoir kept me constantly at the quaint little hotel in the Rue Sainte-Cécile. Boris and I in those days labored hard, but as we pleased, which was fitfully, and we all three, with Jack Scott, idled a great deal together. One quiet afternoon I had been wandering alone over the house, examining curios, prying into odd corners, bringing out sweetmeats and cigars from strange hiding places, and at last I stopped in the bathing room. Boris, all over clay, stood there, washing his hands. The room was built of rose-colored marble, excepting the floor, which was tessellated in rose and gray. In the center was a square pool sunken below the surface of the floor. Steps led down into it, sculptured pillars supporting a frescoed ceiling. A delicious marble cupid appeared to have just alighted on his pedestal at the upper end of the room. The whole interior was Boris's work and mine. Boris, in his working clothes of white canvas, scraped the traces of clay and red modeling wax from his handsome hands, and coquetted over his shoulder with the cupid. "I see you," he insisted. "Don't try to look the other way and pretend not to see me. You know who made you, you little humbug." It was always my role to interpret Cupid's sentiments in these conversations, and when my turn came I responded in such manner that Boris seized my arm and dragged me toward the pool, declaring he would duck me. The next instant he dropped my arm and turned pale. "Good God," he said, "I forgot the pool is full of the solution." I shivered a little and dryly advised him to remember better where he had stored the precious liquid. "In heaven's name, why'd you keep a small lake of that gruesome stuff here of all places?" "I want to experiment on something large," he replied. "On me, for instance?" Came too close for jesting. "But I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organized living body. There is that big white rabbit," he said, following me into the studio. "Oh no, not great. Not the rabbit, not the rabbit." Jack Scott, wearing a paint-stained jacket, came wandering in, appropriated all the oriental sweetmeats he could lay his hands on, looted the cigarette case, and finally he and Boris disappeared together to visit the Luxembourg Gallery, where a new silver bronze by Rodin and a landscape of Monet's were claiming the exclusive attention of artistic France. I went back to the studio and resumed my work. It was a Renaissance screen, which Boris wanted me to paint for Guinevere's boudoir. But a small boy, who was unwillingly dawdling through a series of poses for it, today refused all bribes to be good. He never rested an instant in the same position, and inside of 5 minutes I had as many different outlines of the little beggar. "Are you posing, or are you executing a song and dance, my friend?" I inquired. "Whichever Monsieur pleases," he replied with an angelic smile. Of course I dismissed him for today, and of course I paid him for the full time, that being the way we spoil our models. After the young imp had gone, I made a few perfunctory daubs at my work. I was so thoroughly out of humor that it took me the rest of the afternoon to undo the damage I had done. So at last I scraped my palette, stuck my brushes in a bowl of black soap, and strolled into the smoking room. I believe that, excepting Guinevere's apartments, no room in the house was so free from the perfume of tobacco as this one. It was a queer chaos of odds and ends, hung with threadbare tapestry. A sweet-toned old spinet of good repair stood by the window. There were hands of weapons, some old and dull, others bright and modern, festoons of Indian and Turkish armor over the mantel, 2 or 3 good pictures, and a pipe rack. It was here that we used to come for new sensations in smoking. I doubt if any type of pipe ever existed which was not represented in that rack. When we had selected one, we immediately carried it somewhere else and smoked it, for the place was, on the whole, more gloomy and less inviting than any in the house. But this afternoon the twilight was very soothing. The rugs and skins on the floor looked brown and soft and drowsy. The big couch was piled with cushions. Found my pipe and curled up there for an unaccustomed smoke in the smoking room. I had chosen one with a long, flexible stem, and lighting it fell to dreaming. After a while it went out, but I did not stir. I dreamed on, and presently fell asleep. I awoke to the saddest music I have ever heard. The room was quite dark. I had no idea what time it was. A ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weeping quietly, and I was fool enough to cry out, "Guinevere!" She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light, and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet, and for Boris. I carried her to the divan and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. "I can't find Boris, nor any of the servants," I said. "I know," she answered faintly. "Boris has gone to Ept with Mr. Scott. I did not remember when I sent you for him just now. But he can't get back in that case before tomorrow afternoon, and are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? Awful fool I am, but I was only half awake." "Boris thought you had gone home before dinner. Do please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time." "I've had a long nap," I laughed. "So sound that I did not know whether I was still asleep or not when I found myself staring at a figure that was moving toward me. I called out your name. Have you been trying the old spinet? You must have been playing very softly." I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than that one to see the look of relief that came into her face. She smiled adorably and said in her natural voice, "Alec, I tripped on that wolf's head, and I think my ankle is sprained. Please call Marion, then go home." I did as she bade me, and left her there when the maid came in. Chapter 3. At noon next day, when I called, I found Boris walking restlessly about his studio. "Guinevere is asleep just now," he told me. "The sprain is nothing, but how would she have such a high fever? The doctor can't account for it, or else he will not," he muttered. "Guinevere has a fever?" I asked. "I should say so. Has actually been a little lightheaded at intervals all day. The idea! Gay little Guinevere without a care in the world. She keeps saying her heart's broken and she wants to die." My own heart stood still. Boris leaned against the door of his studio, looking down, his hands in his pockets, his kind, keen eyes clouded, a new line of trouble drawn o'er the mouth's good mark that made me smile. The maid had orders to summon him the instant Guinevere opened her eyes. We waited, and waited, and Boris, growing restless, wandered about, fussing with modeling wax and red clay. Suddenly he started for the next room. "Come and see my rose-colored bath full of death," he cried. "Is it death?" I asked, to humor his mood. "Not prepared to call it life, I suppose," he answered. As he spoke, he plucked a solitary goldfish, squirming and twisting out of its globe. "Why must this man keep killing goldfish? We'll send this one after the other, whoever that is," he said. There was a feverish excitement in his voice. A dull weight of fever lay on my limbs and on my brain as I followed him to the fair crystal pool with its pink-tinted sides, and he dropped the creature in. Falling, its scales flashed with a hot orange gleam in its angry twistings and contortions. The moment it struck the liquid, it became rigid and sank heavily to the bottom. Then came the milky foam, the splendid hues radiating on the surface. Then a shaft of pure, serene light broke through from seemingly infinite depths. Boris plunged in his hand and drew out an exquisite marble thing, blue-veined, rose-tinted, and glistening with opalescent drops. "Child's play," he muttered, and looking wearily, longingly, at me, as if I could answer such questions. But Jack Scott came in and entered into the game, as he called it, with ardor. Nothing would do but to try the experiment on the White Rabbit, then and there. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see life go out of a warm, living creature, and I declined to be present. Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments, which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder, when Boris and Jack came in bringing their marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above, and a cry came from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash, and the next moment he called, "Jack, run for the doctor. Bring him back with you. Alec, come here." I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Guinevere, sitting bolt upright, with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris's gentle restraint. He called me to help. At my first touch she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes. And then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looking straight into Boris's face. Poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. At the same instant, our three lives turned into new channels. The bond that held us so long together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place, for she had spoken my name. And as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged in my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you." But he could not finish, as the doctor stepped swiftly into the room, saying, "Ah, the fever!" I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street, saying Boris would rather be alone. We crossed the street to our own apartment, and that night, seeing I was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with a distinction was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of The King in Yellow, Pallid mask. I was very ill, for the strain of 2 years which I had endured since that fatal May morning when Guinevere murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best," told on me at last. I never imagined that it could become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself. Although the inward battle raged night after night, and I, lying alone in my room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Guinevere, the morning always brought relief. And I returned to Guinevere and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempests of the night. Never in word or deed or thought while with them, I had betrayed my sorrow even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me. It was a part of me. Night lifted, laying bare the stifled truth below, but there was no one to see except myself. And when the day broke, the mask fell back again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick, but they were hopelessly entangled with visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's basin, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Guinevere, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the King in Yellow, wrapped in the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, "Not upon us, O king, not upon us. Feverishly, I struggled to put it from me. I saw the lake of Hali thin and blank, without a ripple or wind or stir. I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon. Aldebaran, the Hides, Alar, Hester, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the king in yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Guinevere. What this obligation was, its nature, was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support through a great crisis. Whatever it seemed to be, for the time, its weight rested only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond with my whole soul. There were always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognized, Boris among them. Afterward, they told me that this could not have been, but I know at least once he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice, and a cloud settled back on my senses and I lost him. But he did stand there and bend over me once, at least. At last one morning, I awoke to find the sunlight falling across my bed, and Jack Scott reading beside me. I had not strength enough to speak aloud, neither could I think, much less remember, but I could smile feebly, as Jack's eyes met mine. When he jumped up and asked eagerly if I wanted anything, I could whisper, "Yes, Boris." Jack moved to the head of my bed and leaned down to arrange my pillow. I did not see his face, but he answered heartily, "You must wait, Alec. You're too weak to see even Boris." I waited and grew strong. In a few days I was able to see him whom I would, but meanwhile I had thought and remembered. From the moment when all the past grew clear again in my mind, I never doubted what I should do when the time came, and I felt sure that Boris would have resolved upon the same course so far as he was concerned. As for what pertained to me alone, I knew he would see that also as I did. I no longer asked for any one. I never inquired why no message came from them. Why, during the week I lay there, waiting and growing stronger, I never heard their name spoken. Preoccupied with my own searchings for the right way, and with my feeble but determined fight against despair, I simply acquiesced in Jack's reticence, taking for granted that he was afraid to speak of them, lest I should turn unruly and insist on seeing them. Meanwhile, I said over and over to myself, how would it be when life began again for us all? We would take up our relations exactly as they were before Guinevere fell ill. Boris and I would look into each other's eyes, and there would be neither rancor nor cowardice nor mistrust in that glance. I would be with them again for a little while in the dear intimacy of their home, and then, without pretext or explanation, I would disappear from their lives forever. Boris would know. Guinevere, the only comfort was that she would never know. It seemed, as I thought it over, that I had found the meaning of that sense of obligation which had persisted all through my delirium, and the only possible answer to it. So when I was quite ready, I beckoned Jack to me one day, and I said, "Jack, I want Boris at once, and take my dearest greeting to Guinevere." But at last, he made me understand that they were both dead. I fell into a wild rage that tore all my little convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse from which I crawled forth some weeks afterward, a boy of 21, who I believed his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day when Jack handed me a letter and the keys to Boris's house, I took them without a tremor and asked him to tell me all. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned wearily on his thin hands to reopen the wound, which could never entirely heal. He began very quietly. "Alec, unless you have a clue that I know nothing about, you will not be able to explain any more than I what has happened. I suspect that you would rather not hear these details, but you must learn them, else I would spare you the relation. God knows I wish I could be scared to telling. I shall use few words. That day when I left you in a doctor's care and came back to Boris, I found him working on the fates. Guinevere, he said, was sleeping under the influence of drugs. She'd been quite out of her mind, he said. He kept on working, not talking any more, and I watched him. Before long, I saw that the third figure of the group, the one looking straight ahead, out over the world, bore his face. Not as you ever saw it, but as it looked then and to the end. This is one thing for which I should like to find an explanation, but I never shall. Well, he worked, and I watched him in silence, and we went on that way until nearly midnight. Then we heard the door open and shut sharply, and a swift rush in the next room. Boris sprang through the doorway, and I followed, but we were too late. She lay at the bottom of the pool, her hands across her breast. Then Boris shot himself through the heart. Jack stopped speaking. Drops of sweat stood under his eyes, and his thin cheeks twitched. I carried Boris to his room. Then I went back and let that hellish fluid out of the pool, and, turning on all the water, washed the marble clean of every drop. When at length I dared descend the steps, I found her lying there as white as snow. At last, when I had decided what was best to do, I went into the laboratory and first emptied the solution in the basin into the waste pipe. Then I poured the contents of every jar and bottle after it. There was wood in the fireplace, so I built a fire, and breaking the locks of Boris's cabinet, I burnt every paper, notebook, and letter that I found there. With a mallet from the studio, I smashed to pieces all the empty bottles. Then, loading them into a coal scuttle, I carried them to the cellar and threw them over a red-hot bed of the furnace. 6 times I made the journey, and at last not a vestige remained of anything which might again aid in seeking for the formula which Boris had found. Then, at last, I dared call the doctor. He's a good man, and together we struggled to keep it from the public. Without him, I never could have succeeded. At last we got the servants paid and sent away into the country, where old Rosier keeps them quiet with stories of Boris's and Guinevere's travels in distant lands, from whence they will not return for years. We buried Boris in the little cemetery of Sèvres. The doctor's a good creature, knows what to pity a man who can bear no more. He gave his certificate of heart disease and asked no questions of me. Then, lifting his head from his hands, he said, open the letter, Alec. It is for us both. I tore it open. It was Boris's will, dated a year before. He left everything to Guinevere, and in case of her dying childless, I was to take control of the house in the Rue Sainte-Cécile. Jack Scott, the management at Ept. On our deaths, the property reverted to his mother's family in Russia, with the exception of the sculptured marbles executed by himself. These he left to me. The page blurred under our eyes, and Jack got up and walked to the window. Presently he returned and sat down again. I dreaded to hear what he was going to say, but he spoke with the same simplicity and gentleness. Guinevere lies before the Madonna in the marble room. The Madonna bends tenderly above her, and Guinevere smiles back into that calm face that never would have been except for her. His voice broke, but he grasped my hand, saying, "Courage, Alec." Next morning he left for Ept to fulfill his trust. Chapter 4. The same evening I took the keys and went into the house I had known so well. Everything was in order, but the silence was terrible. Though I went twice to the door of the marble room, I could not force myself to enter. It was beyond my strength. I went into the smoking room and sat down before the spinet. A small lace handkerchief lay on the keys, and I turned away, choking. It was plain I could not stay, so I locked every door, every window, and the 3 front and back gates and went away. Next morning, Alcide packed my valise, and leaving him in charge of the apartments, I took the Orient Express for Constantinople. During the 2 years that I had wandered through the East, at first, in our letters, we never mentioned Guinevere and Boris, but gradually their names crept in. I recollect particularly a passage in one of Jack's letters replying to one of mine. What you tell me of seeing Boris bending over you while you lay ill, and feeling his touch on your face, and hearing his voice, of course, troubles me. This that you describe must have happened a fortnight after he died. I say to myself that you were dreaming, that it was part of your delirium. The explanation does not satisfy me, nor would it you. Toward the end of the 2nd year, a letter came from Jack to me in India, so unlike anything that I had ever known of him, that I decided to return at once to Paris. He wrote, "I am well, and sell all my pictures as artists do, who have no need of money. I have not a care of my own, but I am more restless than if I had. I am unable to shake off a strange anxiety about you. It is not apprehension, it is a rather breathless expectancy, what God knows. I can only say it is wearing me out. Nights I dream always of you and Boris. I can never recall anything afterward, but I wake in the morning with my heart beating, and all day the excitement increases until I fall asleep at night to recall the same experience. I am quite exhausted by it, and I have determined to break up the morbid condition. I must see you. Shall I go to Bombay, or will you come to Paris?" I telegraphed him to expect me by the next steamer. When we met, I thought he changed very little. I, he insisted, looked in splendid health. It was good to hear his voice again, and as we sat and chatted about what life still held for us, we felt that it was pleasant to be alive in the bright spring weather. We stayed in Paris together a week, and then I went for a week to Apt with him. But first of all, we went to the cemetery at Sèvres, where Boris lay. "Shall we place the Fates in the little grove above him?" Jack asked, and I answered, "I think only the Madonna should watch over Boris's grave." But Jack was none the better for my own coming. The dreams of which she could not retain even the least definite outline continued. He said that at times a sense of breathless expectancy was suffocating. "You see I do you harm and not good," I said. "Try a change without me." So he started alone for a ramble among the Channel Islands, and I went back to Paris. I had not yet entered Boris's house, not mine since my return, but I knew it must be done. It had been kept in order by Jack. There were servants there, so I gave up my own apartment and went there to live. Instead of the agitation I had feared, I found myself able to paint there tranquilly. I visited all the rooms, all but one. I could not bring myself to enter the marble room where Guinevere lay. Yet I felt a longing growing daily to look upon her face, to kneel beside her. One April afternoon, I lay dreaming in the smoking room, just as I had laid 2 years before, and mechanically I looked among the tawny eastern rugs for the wolfskin. At last I distinguished the pointed ears and flat, cruel head, and I thought of my dream where I saw Guinevere lying beside it. The helmet still hung against the threadbare tapestry, among them the old Spanish morion which I had remembered Guinevere had once put on when we were amusing ourselves with the ancient bits of mail. I turned my eyes toward the spinet. Every yellow key seemed eloquent of her caressing hand. I rose, drawn by the strength of all my life's passion, to the sealed door of the marble room. The heavy door swung inward under my trembling hands. Sunlight poured through the window, tipping with gold the wings of Cupid, and lingered like a nimbus over the brows of the Madonna. Her tender face bent in compassion over a marbled form so exquisitely pure that I knelt and signed myself. Guinevere lay in the shadow under the Madonna, and yet through her white arms I saw the pale azure vein, and beneath her softly clasped hands the folds of her dress were tinged with rose, as if from some faint warm light within her breast. Bending with a breaking heart, I touched the marble drapery with my lips, and crept back into the silent house. Maid came and brought me a letter, and I sat down in the little conservatory to read it. But as I was about to break the seal, seeing the girl lingering, I asked her what she wanted. She stammered something about a white rabbit that had been caught in the house, and asked what should be done with it. I told her to let it loose in the walled garden behind the house, and opened my letter. It was from Jack, but so incoherent that I thought he must have lost his reason. It was nothing but a series of prayers to me not to leave the house until he could get back. He could not tell me why. There were the dreams, he said. He could explain nothing. But he was sure I must not leave the house in the Rue Sainte-Cécile. As I finished reading, I raised my eyes and saw the same maidservant standing in the doorway holding a glass dish in which 2 goldfish were swimming. Put them back into the tank and tell me what you mean by interrupting me, I said. With a half-suppressed whimper, she emptied water and fish into the aquarium at the end of the conservatory and, turning to me, asked my permission to leave my service. She said people were playing tricks on her, evidently with a design of getting her into trouble. The marble rabbit had been stolen and a live one had been brought into the house. The 2 beautiful marble fish were gone, and she had just found those common live things flopping on the dining room floor. I reassured her and sent her away, saying I would look about it myself. I went into my studio. There was nothing there but my canvases and some casts, except the marvel of the Easter lily. I sat on a table across the room, then I strode angrily over to it. But the flower I lifted from the table was fresh and fragile, and filled the air with perfume. Then suddenly, I comprehended and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The doors flew open, the sunlight streamed into my face, and through it, in a heavenly glory, the Madonna smiled, as Guinevere lifted her flushed face from her marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. Now that was The Mask, the second of the stories from The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. And that will be where I'm ending the stream for tonight. I'm not sure when I will do more book reading in the future. I definitely know I want to read more of Lovecraft, especially with Gray helping me. Obviously, I want to finish The King in Yellow at a minimum in regards to works by Robert W. Chambers. Although, obviously, tomorrow I'll be reading some Edgar Allan Poe with Lily nearby, which will also be fun, although I still haven't decided what to do for Halloween proper. Hopefully you all enjoyed the reading. Anyone listening now or in the future, or who was here towards the start of the stream. Leastwise, there was Timmy here. And Gray will probably listen to these later. But yeah. I'll see some of y'all tomorrow for Poe. I'll see some of y'all the day after for Halloween, and then we've got the Extra Life stream on November 8th. Keep an ear to the ground for that. But yeah, with all that out of the way, good night, everybody. Sleep well. Sleep tight.